Hey everyone! In this video, I'll be showcasing the most loyal players and their longest careers at a single club. Thiago Silva spent 8 years in PSG. Ederson spent 8 years in Man City. Cristiano Ronaldo spent 9 years in Real Madrid. Gareth Bale spent 9 years in Real Madrid. Phil Foden spent 9 years in Man City. Casemiro spent 9 years in Real Madrid. Kevin De Bruyne spent 10 years in Man City. Toni Kroos spent 10 years in Real Madrid. Alan Shearer spent 10 years in Newcastle United. Lucas Vazquez spent 10 years in Real Madrid. Sergio Aguero spent 10 years in Man City. Pep spent 10 years in Real Madrid. David Beckham spent 11 years in Man United. Jordi Alba spent 11 years in Barcelona. Cesar Azpilicueta spent 11 years in Chelsea. Jan Oblak spent 11 years in Atletico Madrid. Samir Handanovic spent 11 years in Inter Milan. Dani Carvajal spent 12 years in Real Madrid. Hugo Lloris spent 12 years in Tottenham Hotspur. Jordan Henderson spent 12 years in Liverpool. Marquinhos Haas spent 12 years in PSG. Marco Reus spent 12 years in Dortmund. Luka Modric spent 13 years in Real Madrid. Harry Kane spent 13 years in Tottenham Hotspur. Nacho spent 13 years in Real Madrid. Bastian Schweinsteiger spent 13 years in Bayern Munich. Karim Benzema spent 14 years in Real Madrid. Carles Puyol spent 15 years in Barcelona. Klaus Augenthaler spent 15 years in Bayern Munich. Gary Kelly spent 15 years in Leeds United. Steve Cherundolo spent 15 years in Hannover 96. Marcelo spent 15 years in Real Madrid. Sergio Busquets spent 15 years in Barcelona. Sergio Ramos spent 16 years in Real Madrid. Koke spent 16 years in Atletico Madrid. Andres Iniesta spent 16 years in Barcelona. Chendo spent 16 years in Real Madrid. Matthew Letizier spent 16 years in Southampton. Iker Casillas spent 16 years in Real Madrid. Francesco Magnanelli spent 17 years in Sassuolo. Tony Hibbert spent 17 years in Everton. Jamie Carragher spent 17 years in Liverpool. Lionel Messi spent 17 years in Barcelona. Michael Zorc spent 17 years in Dortmund. Thomas Schaaf spent 17 years in Werder Bremen. Emili Sagi Barba spent 17 years in Barcelona. Textexu Rajo spent 17 years in Athletic Bilbao. Claude Poole spent 17 years in AS Monaco. Bill Nicholson spent 17 years in Tottenham Hotspur. Fran spent 17 years in Deportivo. Dieter Iltz spent 17 years in Werder Bremen. Ray Lambert spent 17 years in Liverpool. Jimmy Adamson spent 17 years in Burnley. Eddie Gray spent 17 years in Leeds United. Thomas Muller spent 17 years in Bayern Munich. Xavi spent 17 years in Barcelona. Steven Gerrard spent 17 years in Liverpool. Giorgio Chiellini spent 18 years in Juventus. Manolo Sanchez spent 18 years in Real Madrid. Mark Noble spent 18 years in West Ham United. Giacinto Fischetti spent 18 years in Inter Milan. Carlo Bagato spent 18 years in Juventus. Gianpaolo Bellini spent 18 years in Atalanta. Bob McKinley spent 18 years in Nottingham Forest. Pale spent 18 years in Santos. Daniel De Rossi spent 18 years in Roma. Sepp Maier spent 18 years in Bayern Munich. Jose Angel Iribar spent 18 years in Athletic Bilbao. Bruno Conti spent 18 years in Roma. Gianluca Torri spent 19 years in Monaco. Bill Foulkes spent 25 years in Man United. Wes Seeler spent 19 years in Hamburger SV. Nigel Gibbs spent 19 years in Watford. Gary Neville spent 19 years in Man United. Tony Actams spent 19 years in Arsenal. Javier Zanetti spent 19 years in Inter Milan. Ricardo Boccini spent 19 years in Independiente. Paul Scholes spent 20 years in Man United. Billy Wright spent 20 years in Wolverhampton. Sepp Smith spent 20 years in Leicester City. Giuseppe Bergomi spent 20 years in Inter Milan. Franco Baresi spent 20 years in AC Milan. Lev Yashin spent 20 years in Dynamo Moscow. Jack Charlton spent 21 years in Leeds United. Alessandro Costacurta spent 21 years in AC Milan. Camps spent 22 years in Mönchengladbach. Rogerio Ceni spent 22 years in Sao Paulo. Billy Little spent 23 years in Liverpool. Ernst Kuzora spent 23 years in Schalke 04. Ted Segar spent 24 years in Everton. Max Morlock spent 24 years in Nuremberg. Fritz Sayson spent 24 years in Schalke 04. Ryan Giggs spent 24 years in Man United. Bob Crompton spent 24 years in Blackburn Rovers. Francesco Totti spent 24 years in Roma. Paolo Maldini spent 25 years in AC Milan.